Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you all join us here. I'm Oscar Wendell with MCH Global, and honored to have arguably the most, what shall we call you? Controversial economist of our time, inventor of quantitative easing, and today the foremost expert in CBDCs, I would say. And we'll be having a discussion this evening on CBDCs primarily. But before we start, I would like to allow you to introduce yourself about what you've done in your career and your research with quantitative easing, being a best-selling author that has outsold Harry Potter for weeks in Japan. Please.
Well, I suppose I'm always amazed that some people consider me controversial. And admittedly, I committed the great fundamental heresy in economics of introducing the scientific research method to economics. Exactly. Those who haven't studied economics can probably not fathom how economists actually work. Since David Ricardo, 200 odd years ago, in classical British English equilibrium economics, this methodology was introduced. It's also known as the Ricardian vice, after David Ricardo, which is the technique to make unrealistic, fictional assumptions in order to create a logical argument that gives you the predetermined desired outcome. And this method is called the deductive method because you have axioms and assumptions. And there's very little reference to facts and reality. And of course, if you go to the natural sciences, in biology, chemistry, physics, they use the opposite methodology, the inductive methodology, which is to start with facts, observations, data. Of course, in the social sciences, that is history, what actually happened. Get the data, and then you formulate based on the data, maybe hypotheses, you test them, and that's how you find out how the world works. But this has been essentially forbidden in economics since certainly the early 19th century. And I decided, well, that's nonsense. There's no good reason why we can't use the scientific research method also in economics. Now, some of you who may have just browsed through some economics journals said, well, hang on, that is scientific, all this mathematics. And, well, it's meant to look scientific. Mathematics is a tool of pure logic. And what they present in mainstream economics is logical. There's no doubt about that. And it's consistent within its own terms and its own confines, in fact, within its fictional world. But just because it's logical and consistent doesn't mean at all that it's true. And so I adopted the scientific research method, and when people ask me, so what's your school of thought? Are you Keynesian? Are you monetarist? Are you, neoclassical? What are you? Vixalian? Well, I call it scientific economics, which, well, sort of does get the economists a bit annoyed because it does suggest what they're doing is highly unscientific. Anyway, so for some reason that seems to be controversial.
Well, I suppose economics in this day and age is more emotional and political more than being a science, and that's where the sensitivity lies.
Exactly. And so the reality, of course, is that economics is always about money and power. And that's precisely why the mainstream has neither of them in them. There's not even money in these economic models. Certainly not banks either. And also power is considered, no, we can't mention that. So when the 2008 banking crisis happened, of course the journalists want to interview some experts. Well, let's ask the professors of economics at Harvard University, MIT, please comment. I mean, banks are going bust. Stock markets are collapsing, companies are going bust, the economy is shrinking, crisis, recession, unemployment. Please comment, what happened? Well, the honest answer would have been, by all these professors of economics, Harvard, MIT, Oxford. Well, sorry, I can't comment. Oh, why not? Why can't you comment? You're the expert. Well, I don't have banks in my models. And this is what's even true for the central banks. And even today, most central banks use these dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, which all sounds very scientific, but it's just a smokescreen, it's just rhetoric, because it assumes general equilibrium, which, I mean, what's the probability of having equilibrium even in one market? They need 8 assumptions at least to hold at the same time. You know, the axiom of the rational utility maximizer that doesn't care about others, can't be influenced by others, can't be influenced by advertising. Google, of course, doesn't exist in this world, you know, and advertising doesn't work in this world. In fact, the world is empty because we all died as babies because nobody cares about anyone else. It's just, you know, it's an insane theoretical world. And then you add assumptions that you admit aren't true. Perfect information, complete markets, perfectly flexible, instantaneously adjusting prices, you know, infinite life, blah, 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 keep going. Now, if all these assumptions hold, then you have equilibrium in one market. But even if you, I mean, these economists, they pride themselves on using mathematics to pretend to be scientific, but they haven't even done their basic calculations. Because if you're generous and you assume that, let's say that one of these assumptions has a probability of being true of, say, is more likely to be true than not, so more than 50%, 55%, which is wildly, optimistic. If you've got 8 assumptions, what is the probability that you get equilibrium? All 8 have to hold at the same time. It's joint probability. You've got to multiply the 0.55, to the power of 8. So what is it? It's 0.8%. But the individual probability is not 55%, it's more like 0. So we are talking about the reality, the real world just has no equilibrium. And then it's talking about general equilibrium. That means all markets at the same time in equilibrium. I mean, it's such a fictional world. So central banks even, in their models, don't have banks in them. They don't have money in them. That's the sort of extreme, crazy world that economists create. And then if you're just interested in reality, as I've always been, already as a student, then that's considered, rocking the boat and highly heretic and, very controversial. So,
well, you're rocking the boat where the power lies, and the balance of power is shifting. I want to talk about that with CBDCs and how it will impact the role of banks and the role of governments and the equilibrium as we see it in the market today.
Yes, of course, there is no equilibrium. There's never been in any market. That's
the equilibrium between the public and the,
I know what you mean. Yeah. You're using it figuratively, which
yes.
is fine. But, for economists, they literally argue that we have these equilibria. Of course, in a reality where we don't have equilibrium, we have rationing. And rationing means demand is not equal to supply in every market. And that means the short side principle applies, which means the shorter of demand or supply determines the outcome. That's the common denominator. That's the only thing that can be traded. The smaller quantity of demand or supply. And the short side has power. And suddenly power is in every market. Because the short side can pick and choose with who to trade. And there's tons of examples in any market. Labor market is perhaps the most obvious one, but it's true for every market. It's even true for liquid, deep markets like bond markets. When you've got to sell your bond portfolio under stress, you realize, I've got Turkey, 2037, 9.5%. That's exactly what you're selling, you see. It's a very discrete, specific government bond. You need a buyer exactly for that bond. And, it may take a while. So where's the equilibrium? So the short side is power. And, of course, the fundamental tool that everyone needs to use is money. And with money, what is the short side and what is the long side? What do you think? Which is larger, the demand for money or the supply of money? Any guesses?
Yes.
What's your feeling?
I think that up until your intervention, I think up until then, probably the demand was higher than supply. That's why.
The demand surely is higher than supply because money is so useful, obviously for philanthropic and good projects. But we all would like to have more money because it gives us more possibilities and things to do and implement our ideas. So the demand for money is essentially infinite. And therefore the short side is the supply. Okay, so who's supplying the money? I did a survey in Frankfurt and my students helped me. My courses started to get very large. I mean, I had this optional course initially, 50 students, but by the 5th semester, it was 450. Everyone signed up. So I sent them out on the streets and we did the survey, over 1,000 questionnaires, so it's quite statistically quite relevant. And the question was, who do you think creates the majority of the money supply and allocates this money supply in the economy? And of course, it's multiple choice, make it easier. And the outcome was that 84% of the people polled, which is probably above average education in central Frankfurt, thought that the money is created by the government or the central bank, which is a very reasonable answer. It's just not true. Governments create zero money. There's some tiny, tiny exceptions. If you're interested, we can talk about those. But governments don't create money. They borrow money at interest. That's why we have this national debt in most countries. And central banks, well, they only create 3 or 4% of the money supply. Who creates the 97% of the money supply? Well, you mentioned them. It's the banks. But that's been a well-kept secret for centuries. Initially, it was well-kept because both parties in the bank activities had an interest in keeping it secret, because until 350 years ago, all over Europe, usury was forbidden in Europe. And actually many parts of the world, and perhaps even most parts of the world, charging interest was illegal, and therefore everyone involved kept it quiet. Now that played into the hands of the banks because they could keep their business model quiet as well, which was not to lend money. Economists say banks are deposit-taking institutions that lend money. And the reality, you have to remember, is almost always the exact opposite of what the mainstream economists tell you. So the reality is banks don't take deposits and banks don't lend money. At law, it's very clear, particularly if you take English law, which was created together with modern banking to suit modern banking in the 17th century with the creation of the Bank of England. And English law is very clear-cut on this. Banks don't take deposits because the concept of a deposit at a bank doesn't exist at law. It doesn't exist. It is simply, and the courts are very clear on this, it is simply a loan that you give to the bank. You're just a general creditor. There's no such thing as a deposit. It's not a deposit in any sort of sense that we use it. It's not held in custody, it's not a bailment, it's not warehoused. No, it is a loan to the bank. So, banks don't take deposits. But surely banks lend money. No, they don't. They're in the business of purchasing securities. Because when you take a loan, the loan contract you sign, at law, is a promissory note that you've issued. And the bank is buying that. Now, the bank owes you money, which means it will make a record of its debt to you, which we call bank deposits. And then you say, well, I don't care about these details. Just give me the money when you borrow the money. And the banker will say, you'll find it in your account if they're careful. They may say, we've transferred it to your account. That would be wrong. Because what you get into your account when you take a bank loan, and I could show this, this is the first empirical study of how banks actually work. I mean, imagine this. I mean, this is so typical for economists. They've been arguing for, in the modern era, at least for the past 120 years, between three theories of banking. The currently dominant one is the financial intermediation theory, which says that banks gather deposits, do their analysis, credit rating, and credit, risk assessment, all that, and then give out the loan. They're just intermediaries like non-banks. It's the same thing. And then there's the fractional reserve theory, which is a bit older, which says each bank is a financial intermediary, but in aggregate something strange happens, banks create money. And then there's a third theory, the oldest, which says credit creation theory, banks create money. And when a bank gives a loan, it newly creates money out of nothing, which seems a bit, hard to believe. And of course has been made fun of quite a lot by followers of the other schools. But you get famous people supporting, each of these three schools. Some, like Keynes, support all of them sequentially. Keynes, starting with the credit creation theory, then fractional reserve theory, and then the financial intermediation theory, sort of chronologically in the way they've been pushed out. Anyway, so I thought this is crazy.
But
Let's
this is
use
what
the
your research proved, right?
Exactly. So let's use the scientific research methodology. I mean, that's the scientific thing to do. Let's test the three theories. And they differ in the question of when the loan is given out, where does the money come from? The financial intermediation theory says it comes from deposits. The fractional reserve theory is slightly complicated, but essentially says it comes from reserves held at the central bank, excess reserves. And then the credit creation theory says it doesn't come from anywhere. It's newly created out of nothing. And then it's often polite to put this in Latin, ex nihilo, because then it sounds like something's happening out of nothing. Okay. Anyway, but what's the scientific thing? Do a test. So I managed to do this. You need a bank, and that, of course, was a bit of a constraint, but I found a bank, and we could do the test, and the conclusion was, of course, as you know by now, banks create money out of nothing. And so when you take out that loan, and it's the money is given to you, it's booked into your account at the bank, because that's a record of the bank's debt to you arising from the loan contract. It's essentially an accounts payable liability that the bank now represents as a different type of liability called customer deposits. In common usage, at law, it's just a loan to the bank. So really, you are lending the money to the bank, the bank's lending to you. But anyway, let's keep it simple. The banks create the money out of nothing.
But that money represents value as a ledger, what's in the value in the economy. And,
exactly, we can use it for all the transactions.
If there's no value that's being traded, the money is worth nothing. And now that central banks are coming in with CBDCs, how does that change the role of the banks? And I want to, before you go into that, talk about your role as the chairman of Valhalla Network and the community banks that you're expanding across Europe.
Yes. Perhaps just to link it to the earlier comments. So, the demand for money is larger than supply. So the short side is the supply. We've now identified who is the short side, has the power to create and allocate the money, is actually the banks. But of course, the banks don't act on their own. There's the supervision of bank regulators, the central banks in particular, the central planners at the central banks. And so that is the short side, and that's, of course, what is essentially also in charge of the economy. But the type of banks you have will reshape the economic landscape. It makes a huge difference. If you've got 5 large banks that follow their business model as large banks, which means basically you need to do large deals with large customers. When your balance sheet is 2,000 billion pounds and you want to grow by 5%, there's no point really in giving 30,000, 50,000 pound SME, small firm loans, right? You want to cut the loan checks sort of by the billion, by the yard, as they say in the city, right? A billion is a yard. When you're in the train to the city, you don't want the other passengers to really be too shocked by the sort of figures you're discussing. Anyway, so that's the code. And so this power is in the banking system and has really been wielded by the central banks. And they have been quite good at also hiding the true mechanisms. And here's the other huge smoke screen. I just have to explain that, and then we can talk about CBDCs, because then the scene is set. I mean, how do central banks operate? Well, the official story, I think everyone will have heard it so many times. How do central banks operate? Like, what do they do mostly, or talk about mostly?
The interest.
Print money is that is the common sense cutting through all the hot air. And And of course, technically, the printed money is only 5% of money, so it's already speaking figuratively. But what do they claim they're doing? What do they claim?
They're supposed to regulate
Financial systems.
Okay, I heard it, yes.
Manage inflation.
Interest rate.
Interest rates, exactly. So they do all these things, manage the economy, inflation, whatever, with interest rates. And they will constantly claim, and they have for the past 70 years, repeatedly said it. That's what economists also repeat then. I mean, central banks, of course, are the biggest employer of economists on the planet. And central banks have therefore been quite influential in shaping this fictional deductive economics, which is ideal for their purposes because, with this, it's uniquely susceptible to getting the result that you want to get, when you have this fictional theoretical model that is really not related to reality. And so the central banks have been claiming that they use interest rates to do this. But what's the empirical evidence? And of course they say we're using interest rates because, it's the price of money and in equilibrium. It's actually prices that give us equilibrium. So it's part of this equilibrium framework where prices dominate quantities. And the price of money, of course, is the most important price. And by lowering rates, what happens with the economy? Stimulus for the economy. If you raise rates, as now have been saying for the past year, well, we're raising rates to slow the economy. Okay. Now that particular claim, this is the interest rate thesis. Interest rates are negatively correlated with growth. Higher rates, lower growth. Lower rates, higher growth. And causation from interest rates to growth, right? That is the big claim. And that's been repeated actually for 200 years since this classical economics from David Ricardo. And it's actually the one thing that all these different schools of thought in economics agree on. Okay, now how many empirical studies exist that demonstrate this? What do you think? I mean, they've been saying this for 200 years. So by now, and of course then maybe the statistics wasn't so good, so maybe in the last 100 years you get more and more statistical studies and econometric studies, and then perhaps in the last 40, 50 years you get the maximum, because now we just press the button, you get your output of the econometric model. So maybe, what's your guess? Is it in the 10,000s, the studies proving this, or thousands, or what do you think? 6 studies, that's enough? Well, actually, the real answer is 0. There's not a single study, and there has never been one. Because it's just not true. It's not true. The one thing that all these economists agree on is not true. So again, I did the first empirical study, open-ended, just finding out how are interest rates and economic growth related. And it turns out the truth is the opposite of what they tell you in both dimensions. It's not negative correlation, it's a positive correlation. And the causation doesn't run from interest rates to growth, but from growth to interest rates. So instead of lower rates leading to higher growth, the truth is high growth leads to high rates. Low growth leads to low rates. Why have interest rates been rising? Well, it's highly predictable. Because nominal GDP growth has been boosted dramatically. By what? So, in other words, what is actually driving the economy? It's not interest rates, they follow. It's not the price of money, it's the quantity of money. And what is the quantity of money? Where does money come from? We know the answers. It's bank credit creation. And so what happened in March 2020, and this is now coming back to CBDCs. So in March 2020, the Federal Reserve gave the order to massively print money, we would say, expand credit creation through the banking system and push the money into the economy. And this is actually a way central banks can push money into the economy through banks on order. It is when central banks purchase assets from the non-bank sector. That was the second type of quantitative easing I recommended in Japan in 1995, published in the Nikkei. For an economy that had a banking crisis, the money supply has been shrinking, there's been massive deflation, record deflation, and you do need to expand the money supply. But the Fed did this in March 2020. And it instructed the central banks in its sphere of influence, which is Five Eyes plus EU, to do the same. And Japan, of course, Five Eyes plus EU plus Japan, yeah. And a few, Taiwan, some other.
And what's the motivation behind that?
Well, it was to create inflation. And this was announced. Check it out. It's been published in advance. In fact, they were implementing what was proposed by BlackRock, the world's biggest asset manager, in the double-digit trillion dollars, in August 2019. Go to the Jackson Hole conference or on the BlackRock website. You know, they have their thesis papers there. Late August 2019, it's there. They call it the Going Direct Plan. And they say the next crisis, when it comes, we must create inflation. And here's how we're going to do it. The central bank will purchase assets from non-banks, which is my QE proposal, the second type of QE. That's how you push money into the economy when you have deflation and implosion, which wasn't the case in March 2020. Credit growth was expanding by 6% in America. And then they boosted it up to double digits, 11, 12%. Massive money creation, very unlike 2008. They did QE1, my first type of QE in 2008, at this financial crisis, which is you have a problem in the banking system. You can quickly solve this problem without tax money by the central bank purchasing non-performing assets from banks. You know, the banks find, okay, balance sheet of the banks, we thought the assets were 100. Oh, it's worth only 20. Liabilities are still 100. You have to make up for the minus 80, the 80 hole, from equity. Equity is not 80, it's tiny. Equity is 10% usually, or less for the big banks. So the banks were bust. What do? Well, here's one way. As I proposed in Japan, you can reflate, well, first of all, clean up the bank balance sheets at zero cost to the taxpayer. The central bank simply purchases non-performing assets from banks at face value. Buy them at 100. Shift them to the central bank balance sheet where they can't do any harm. Problem solved. What's the cost to the taxpayer? Zero. The cost was when the banks originally made these bad loans that became non-performing. But why add further costs like a banking crisis and a recession and unemployment as Japan did for 20 years on top of that? Doesn't make sense. That's why I made this proposal. So in 2008, that's what the Fed did. But and people thought, oh, this is going to create inflation. No, because there's no money creation. You just do a booking inside the banking system between the central bank and the banks. Money creation takes place when the banking system, central bank and banks, inject money into the non-bank economy. That didn't take place at that time, so you can't get inflation from this. They didn't do QE2, the second type at that time, but they did it in March 2020. So I'm on the record on my Twitter accounts saying, well, I got the data around May 2020. This must create inflation. There's absolutely no doubt. Significant inflation, double-digit inflation. 18 months later, I said, and it's exactly what happened. Because now this is the second type of QE for the reflation policy, money creation policy. When you have deflation, the central bank purchases performing assets from non-banks. You shift the non. So performing assets from non-banks, in other words, normal companies. Corporate bonds. I mean, in Tokyo, I suggested real estate because Tokyo is not very green and they had this massive implosion in the banking system and the economy shrinking. Central bank can just buy real estate, supports the real estate market. Of course, these sellers, they're not banks, not that many anyway. So their accounts at the banks are credited by the central bank, the bank reserves go up, but the banks create the deposits, money creation, credit creation. That's how you reflate the economy. And so this is what central banks have done. They've created this inflation intention. Now, how do we know that the March 2020 policy to purchase assets from non-banks, huge amounts of corporate bonds and all sorts of purchases, were actually the implementation of the BlackRock plan? How do we know that for sure? Well, look it up. Announcement by the Fed, March 2020. We're hiring BlackRock to buy assets from the economy. It's not a secret. It's not a conspiracy. And the plan was, from start to finish, to create inflation. And that's what they did.
And that's effectively, depending on perspective,
and of course,
confiscation or transfer of wealth.
Of course, I mean, inflation is a transfer of wealth.
And that's not a very original idea. I mentioned the quote from Lenin earlier that the way to crush the bourgeoisie is between the millstone of grinding them between the millstone of inflation and taxation. It's always been the case that governments try to use inflation.
Yes, of course, there's a few more millstones, because central banks are also very good at creating these boom-bust cycles and big recessions, which is another way of transferring ownership, creating bankruptcies and distressed assets and so on. I show in my book, Princes of the Yen, that the entire boom period of the 80s, which was massive excessive credit creation by banks for asset purchases, which must create a bubble and must create a banking crisis afterwards, was done on purpose by the Bank of Japan. And they had a plan, and the details are in the book, Princes of the Yen. And that's proven with eyewitness testimonies. The data, I managed to get all the data, primary sources, secondary sources, and has never been disproven, has been out there since it was a bestseller in Japan in 2001. And that's turned out to be the standard case, that we have these central planners creating crises intentionally, which initially, I mean, you just don't want to believe it. It's hard to believe. But of course, once you're over that, by looking at the evidence and again and again, in almost every country you get examples for that. That's now the sort of background. Now with this background, that's when we should discuss CBDC. So the central planners are now coming out and they dare to say, hey, give us more power. We want even more powers. Now in my book, New Paradigm in Macroeconomics, 2005, I warned of the recurring banking crises, and also the fact that after each banking crisis and economic crisis, we're giving the central planners more power. Because they will argue, it's because, things got wrong. Obviously, we were trying to do the opposite. We're trying to have stable growth, stable prices, stable currency, stable everything. It just didn't quite work out. We didn't have enough powers. And for some reason, that seems to always convince the
but I want to ask you,
powers
though,
of being, they get more powers. And now is the ultimate power push. And that's
before
CBDC.
we go into that,
yeah.
Sure, they've clearly failed in keeping a calm, keeping stability, and there's a boom and bust cycle. But isn't there an advantage with sort of spurring on creative destruction by having a rejuvenation of companies, only the strongest surviving, and capital being allocated to the ones that are the most interesting in terms of short-term innovation?
Well, I would argue that you get this innovation, and we have this creativity. People are creative without the very destructive resource misallocation and waste that comes from the boom-bust cycles and bankruptcies. That's definitely not the most efficient way of running the show, right? How you run the show efficiently and create a lot of prosperity was shown by the East Asian high-growth economies. And they've demonstrated it is possible to have double-digit economic growth for decades. And how do you do that? Well, in my quantity theory of disaggregated credit, I show basically, once you understand banks create money, there's only 3 scenarios. If banks create the money, bank credit creation, and it's used for purchasing ownership rights, usually property is the biggest example because that's also essentially subsidized by the Basel capital adequacy banking rules. Banks love to do property lending, but it can be financial assets, can be any asset. When you do the asset credit creation, because the lending is money creation, this must do something. Money creation always has an effect. So when banks lend for property, because it's money creation, it's like printing money and pumping it into the property market. Now, you don't have to study economics and have a PhD to then conclude that, what's this going to do to property prices? Obviously, they're going to go up. They're driven by the money creation because it's not transferring money from A to B, which is a zero-sum game. And it's new money that didn't exist before pumped into the property market. Of course, property prices go up. And then you get these boom-bust cycles. That's scenario 1, when banks create credit for asset purchases, which is not part of GDP, by the way. because there's no, GDP is a value-added concept.
Yeah.
And by just transferring ownership of rights, well, you're not creating value. You're not, therefore, it's not part of GDP. That explains some other puzzles like velocity decline and so on. Anyway, and then bank credit for GDP transaction, we've got two scenarios. Namely, if bank credit is used for consumption, because bank credit is always money creation, always. Banks never act as intermediaries. It's always net new money that's added to the economy, that's added to the money supply that didn't exist before. So if consumer loans go up, that means, of course, demand goes up. Effective spending on consumer goods immediately goes up. But you haven't done anything about increasing the quantity of goods and services. So what must happen to consumer prices, and that's what we've seen since March 2020, inflation, consumer price inflation. Now, the third possibility is the redeeming feature of banking, and then we can talk about solutions and also alternatives to the CBDC project. The redeeming feature of banking is when banks create credit for productive business investment, to implement new technologies, to increase productivity, to implement these creative ideas that people have. I mean, technology is a recipe, like a cooking recipe. It tells you what ingredients to choose, in what quantities, and then what process to use to get something that has higher value than just the sum of the costs of the inputs, right? Because of this clever idea, which is encompassed in this process, in this technology, whatever it may be. So when you do that, you fund the implementation of new technologies, you are creating value added, and therefore it's not inflationary. You have more demand from the money creation, but you're also delivering more and higher valued goods and services. And that's how you get high economic growth. If you make sure that bank credit is used for productive business investment. And that's what they did in Japan, in Korea, Taiwan, and China. I mean, China is the key example because it was most recent, and also because they moved from a Soviet-style economy where they had what we will get if we allow CBDCs. It will be a Soviet-style economy because central bank digital currencies, I mean, it's a misnomer, really. They're trying to confuse people with this CBDC acronym already, suggesting, and then saying it's the digital aspect that's new. We've been using BDC for decades, bank digital currency. And the digital aspect is nothing new. We've been using that, and it works okay. It's not usually the biggest problem we have in finance and banking is, the transactions. So, we've been using BDCs. So what is new? The C, the centralization aspect. It's the umpire, the referee saying, I want to join the game. Because CBDCs is having an account at the central bank. It's ripping up the 300 plus years implicit agreement that's existed between banks and the central bank, that central banks are the banks of the banks. And the public deals with the banks, but not the central bank. It's a two sort of layer financial system. But now the central banks are saying, the central planners, well, we want to have direct access to the public, which means they're going to compete against the banks. Now, what do you think when the umpire decides to join the game? I mean, is that a fair game? Think of football. Use the red card, the whistle, the yellow card, and the umpire scores the goals, It's unfair competition, absolutely. It also explains probably these mysterious policies by the central planners, certainly in the last 3 decades, which were very anti-bank. If we now realize actually their plan has been, these are long-term plans, to compete against the banks. Well, they have a huge conflict of interest. Then they shouldn't be bank regulators because they're going to hurt the banks. That's exactly what they've done. Since the introduction of the youngest major central bank, the ECB, 5,000 banks have disappeared. The Federal Reserve has killed almost 10,000 banks in the last 35 years. That's what they're doing. They're consolidating the system. So let's look at the extreme case we're going to get when we introduce CBDCs. Ultimately, will drive banks out of business because you then just need the next banking crisis, which is very easy to arrange for the central planners. They've been very good at that. And then, of course, well, there is CBDC now. The banks, well, they're a bit in crisis. What are you going to do? Everyone shifts their money to the central banks, banking system, switch off the lights, pull the plug, it's gone. And then what we then have is the Soviet-style system. The Soviet Union is the dream of central planners. There was only one bank, Gosbank, the central bank. They had many branches, but it was only one bank. This is what the central planners are really adoring and envying. And of course, in the West, they've always had, in the last 40 years, this China envy as well. But the truth is, China did the opposite. 45 years ago, when Deng Xiaoping came to power, it started out being a Soviet sort of, the Mao economy with more or less, just one bank. And then Deng Xiaoping came to power, and actually I started out talking about the inductive and deductive approaches, the theory, abstract, ideology, and then reality. And Deng Xiaoping, actually, when he came to power and gave his first major speech, he talked about that. He says, listen, comrades, don't we want success? Don't we want a strong economy? Don't we all want to get wealthier and have a strong China? I mean, that's good for everyone, including CCP, So yeah, everyone agreed. Well, let's ditch the ideology. That's literally what he said. Let's forget about the ideology. Let's see what works. There's a Chinese saying. Seek truth from facts. It's one of those famous 4-character, you can draw it with your brush. Qi, I think it is, but my Mandarin is not that good. It's easier in Japanese. Qi, Qse. And seek truth from facts is the inductive methodology. You look at the facts, at the data. And so what he did is he traveled to Japan first thing, because there was a country with a single-party state, the LDP having been in power, and that's still true. I mean, with the exception of 3 years in the entire post-war era, one party. So, for somebody coming from communist China, it's kind of, okay, let's see how they do it. And he did say in public, when he traveled to China, I've come to you to seek the elixir of high growth. Now that was a reference the Japanese immediately understood, because there was this legendary figure, like 1,000 years before, this Chinese sage coming from China to Japan. The land of the rising sun is how the Chinese call it. Because, you've got to be in the West to see Japan as the land where the sun rises, right? It wasn't the Japanese coming up with this name. Anyway, so the sage came to the land of the rising sun and was seeking the elixir of life at that time. And that's a famous story, and maybe true, but at least legendary. And so he used those words. I've come to seek the elixir of high growth. And since it is after 6 o'clock, and we are sort of at dinner tables, I can tell you a secret about the Japanese. If ever you have to go to Japan to find out something. You see, in Japan they have 2 truths. The official truth, tatemae, which means literally facade, the outer appearance, and hone, the real truth. Now, you initially, certainly the American reaction was, hang on, that's lying. You mean there's 2 truths that can't be? Come on, let's get real. That's how it's done everywhere, except in Japan. It's the official, everyone knows this, and it's socially, culturally accepted. So if you're in a formal meeting, you will always get the official story. Just don't expect the real truth. And when I was young, as a researcher, often Japanese people took pity with me, and leaving a formal meeting, they would say, Richard, let's meet for dinner. I'll tell you what's really happening. After 6 o'clock, it's off the record. And then you find out. Everyone speaks the truth, and they love to speak the truth. So that's the secret on the Japanese. If you find out the truth, make sure you meet for dinner. A little bit of sake helps, of course. And they will tell you. And so I can absolutely see how Deng Xiaoping was literally told over those, drinking motai and sake, how they did it. And how they did it, how did Japan and then also Korea, Taiwan, get this double-digit economic growth? They used central bank guidance of bank credit, which they called window guidance, to guide bank credit into that area, bank credit for productive business investment, and restrict bank credit for consumption and for asset purchases. And then you get very high economic growth. That was introduced by the Japanese in 1942 in Japan, which included Korea and Taiwan. You know, until 1945, Korea and Taiwan had been part of Japan for half a century. And then when they became independent, they decided, oh, this worked really well, we're going to continue this. They continued this in the 50s and 60s and 70s and got also that double-digit economic growth. And that's exactly what Deng Xiaoping did. Now, of course, a precondition for this is that you have enough banks. And he realized that, and he was told, well, it's better to have more than one bank. So he came back to China and he created thousands of banks, small banks, local banks, savings banks, credit unions, village banks, provincial banks, also some national players, but the majority of the almost 5,000 banks in China, of course, are small local banks that only lend in the local area, which is this principle that Japan had introduced originally from Germany. And that's the secret of success also of 200 years of fairly strong economic growth in Germany, which has just ended last October, by the way. But anyway, so that's how you get high growth. You need many small banks because they lend to small firms. Small firms are important because they're the main employer. 2/3 of employment in every country, in some countries more than 2/3, are with small and medium-sized enterprises. And for economic growth, we need to fund this with bank credit. But big banks will not lend to small firms. It doesn't make any sense. So you need small banks, and that's why we need to create small banks, community banks, local banks that lend in their local area. And that's also the antidote to what the central planners are trying to do. They're trying to kill banks. The ECB has killed 5,000 banks, mainly small banks, of course, forcing them to merge by having high regulatory costs, constantly increasing regulatory burdens, and also the interest rate policies they had for a long time, zero and negative interest rate. And so very anti-bank policies, small banks being driven out, but it is now extremely profitable to be a bank, because interest margins are now very large. And as a small local bank, you know, banking is one of the most profitable industries.
And that's what you're getting into with Valhalla Network, with more community banks.
Yes, indeed. So I've been, for the last 10 years, working to set up community banks. There was a bit of a struggle, I must say, in the UK, where the regulators just don't want small local banks. They want, they call them challenger banks, new essentially payment banks. They don't give out any loans to
They're
small
just cherry
firms.
picking the transaction services.
Exactly, transaction service, that's being supported. But if you want to do SME banking, you know, then if you want to set up a new bank, there's this bunch of guys from the city, they said, let's set up a new bank for the super rich. Oh, here's the license. They got it within record time, you know, banking license.
You only want to...
But community banks actually are good for everyone. This is what they need to realize in the City of London. That's how you create prosperity for everyone. And the thing is, you see, you can have double-digit economic growth in any country, in any region, and for any time period. You can have high and stable growth. So we don't, this is coming back to your earlier question, we don't need the cycles. You can have very high and very stable, non-inflationary, equitable growth. In fact, there's no limit to growth. I mean, this Club of Rome, half a century ago, launched their major first book, you know, The Limits to Growth. And this was essentially the beginning of this major campaign against economic activity and prosperity, which is now under the label of climate change. And that's a whole, you know, it's a very related discussion because, of course, it's linked to CBDCs as well. Anyway, so they were starting to make this argument, limits to growth. There's no limit to growth. It's a complete misunderstanding. And also, growth is not the enemy of the environment. It's totally impossible. Because ask a physicist, what is growth? What is economic growth? There isn't any growth in a physics sense. It's just a statistical concept. And a statistical concept cannot hurt the environment. Now, if you do what they say, oh, let's have zero growth, let's degrowth. So you think that's the end of hurting the environment, environmental destruction? The Amazon won't be cut down anymore? They're still doing it now. In Canada, this woke climate change, whatever government, they're cutting down still these giant 1,000-year-old amazing trees. They're still cutting them down in Canada. That's how much they care about the environment. So with zero growth, you can still have massive environmental destruction. What hurts the environment is environmental destruction, not economic growth. Look at China. When they were poor, they had to look after the high priority, first things first, and lift people out of poverty. Thanks to the creation of banks and window guidance, focusing bank credit on implementing, credit creation for business investment, China had 4 decades of double-digit growth, lifting more people out of poverty than any place in history before. And then they started to care about the environment, and they have now very strict environmental protection rules. So just by saying, oh, let's have zero growth and this is going to somehow be good for the environment, that's complete nonsense, complete misunderstanding. So growth is actually a necessary condition, in my view, to solve the problems of mankind. And I'm really with JFK on this one. Most of our problems are man-made, and they can be solved by man. So let's do it. And of course, the monetary system is a key tool to do that. That's a resource allocation tool. We have to understand it, make it transparent how it really works, and then use it for us. How did the central planners react when I started to publish the truth about banking? Well, princes of the yen, they sent the CIA around to scare me. Then New Paradigm and Macroeconomics came out in 2005. They then started to create these so-called grassroots, AstroTurf grassroots, activist groups that said, oh, banks create money. That's terrible. Let's abolish it. And they were supported by the central planners. And they have been launching CBDCs, the CBDC plan since. In other words, now that the public starts to understand how it works, and we could actually utilize this knowledge and this know-how for the greater good, now they want to abolish it because it mustn't get into the wrong hands like the general public. Isn't that extraordinary, outrageous? So that's, of course, another reason why we have to prevent the introduction of CBDCs. Now, CBDCs are programmable. So let's talk about that.
Yes, what are your objections to CBDCs and what could be
how could
a
one
way
object to this?
So how could you do a CBDC that would be less dangerous to the freedom of the public?
Well, by not doing a CBDC. That's how you do it. You see, the attraction for the central planners of central bank digital currencies is the programmability. And of course, they're all looking into the programmability. Several have made statements like, oh, we won't use that. Okay, maybe, in the first generation, they won't use it, but, there's a new central bank governor and whatever, and suddenly they are using it. The fact is they are working very hard on this. In Brazil, they had this pilot, CBDC, and there's a blockchain programmer who checked out the code and could prove that it already has all the tools in it to freeze your money and to confiscate it, transfer it away without your permission. It's already in the code.
Applicable for USDT as well, which is something that 99% of the population don't know. USDT, everybody uses it. And the transaction itself, they could possibly freeze and pull out your money.
Exactly.
So
exactly. In fact, they're now even moving beyond CBDC. In June this year, the BIS, which is very advanced in its plans for CBDCs, also to be used for inter-central bank transactions and so on. They made the announcement that, well, we need to accelerate tokenization of everything. Now, in principle, if you like blockchain and the tools, that's sort of, that sounds good. But think about it. It's the wrong guys doing it, isn't it? The central bank of the central bankers. And why do they want to tokenize everything? And in the same announcement, they talk about the programmability. And general assets, all assets, bank deposits should also be tokenized. Because, well, then, at the press of the button, the programmability feature can be used. And, oh, well, you've obviously, just ignored all their rules on carbon footprints and you've been eating too much beef or whatever it may be, whatever it may be. So, you have to, your assets have to be transferred, not just your CBDC. They're already starting to talk about going beyond CBDC and linking it
But
on the
can't you do a
blockchain.
CBDC that's not programmable?
Well, even if you can, then you don't need a CBDC. The whole point is the programmability. And it's very official. The Bank of England has formally, officially, publicly asked the UK government for the legal permission to make it programmable.
But isn't it the case already for law-abiding citizens? Basically, I have my title deed to my apartment or my house, my registration to my car, my deposits in the bank, my stock portfolio. All of these, in an institutional society, the courts can freeze them.
Yes.
So,
Yes, yes.
That's different.
Yes, yes.
CBDCs.
I'll defend central bank.
Sure.
It's really for the black economy. It's for the underground mafias where you deprive them. Why is euro so important? Because
Is it important?
Because it's the 500 euro note. Mafias like that because it's so easy to back your ill-gotten gains with euros rather than dollars or yens or dirhams.
Well, I mean, we won't have time to go into the analysis of organized crime and the very close cooperation between the secret services and organized crime. So in other words, when they want it to happen, then it will happen. Opium grown in Afghanistan. Now that one was pulled out of Afghanistan, suddenly, that opium production has suddenly collapsed. How come? And so it's in Colombia and all these Latin American stories. I mean, look them up. So come on, if you now come with that as the main argument, we need to somehow fight organized crime.
No,
Well, then we should first abolish the secret services. Much easier.
My main argument is that what you're warning us from is already there.
Okay, so let me respond to that. Absolutely.
I can have the court freeze my assets.
Yes. So the court, yes, and that of course is a difference. But it shows the way. And of course in the current system we have also been moving in that direction. That is true, but we still have, at least institutionally, various barriers. And you just see the central planners want to move those away, make it very easy to get access to your money. At the moment, it's still decentralized, held in various places, and various custodians or the title deeds in the public record, land record office, and whatever. So it's a hassle for them. But it can be done if you have the courts on your side, which increasingly is the case. So, that point is well taken. Think about Canada, Ottawa, where there were peaceful demonstrations against, the essentially violations of human rights by the government by having all these restrictions. Peaceful demonstrations for weeks, and Trudeau didn't like it. And so in the end, he managed to get a parliamentary approval to have a new law passed, a draconian law that allows the government to order the banks, and not just the banks, actually all financial institutions, to freeze people's assets. But in a way that really just demonstrated to all of us, the sort of things they've been thinking about. And I'm sure he was very sad that they hadn't managed to roll out CBDCs by that time, because then it would have been even faster. So really what CBDCs are doing is they are usurping a parliamentary democratic prerogative, including essentially fiscal policy. How money is spent, that is a parliamentary budgetary prerogative. CBDCs will usurp that and hand it over to the central planners. Now, in many countries, central banks are still privately owned. And historically, it's been created by the big banking dynasties. It's a banking cartel that doesn't like small banks. But that's exactly what we need to do. We need to work in the opposite direction. So while the central planners want to increase their power over our lives, and it's literally not just about total surveillance and monitoring of where you are and what you're spending your money on. It is about this programmability, intervention. And if you don't follow the rules, or you've stepped outside the 15-minute walking distance area, well, your money is not going to work.
So if they manage to introduce CBDCs, if it is inevitable, as some say, how will it end in 10, 20, 50 or 100 years?
It is a completely dystopian scenario, and certainly in much shorter time than a century. Absolutely. I mean, just within a decade, I would say. And so we should stop it in the tracks. That's a very important point. It's so dire that we should not even allow pilot projects. We should have demonstrations outside central banks against this. They don't expect this, by the way. And central bankers, unlike politicians, they don't have any thick skin. And so I really want to encourage you to think about what can we do to safeguard our financial and economic and therefore, essentially general freedom to stop this. Because I noticed, and I was told by one central banker who'd seen the CBDC, been shown it by one of the major old central banks, they were ready to roll it out in 2016. But they didn't. But he was shown it, and it was very small. It was a little, sort of like a grain of rice to be implanted subcutaneously under your skin. And they never talk about that. What is it going to look like, right? And I was quite shocked by the fact that the realization, wow, it's already ready. They can roll it out anytime. So I started to speak up in 2016 in my conference presentations and some written articles and so on. And it seems that they then delayed because they realized there is a bit of a hurdle, particularly with the implant thing, because it is a violation of human dignity, no doubt. And so there will be a lot of people arguing against this.
But Richard,
And so
sure
yeah.
that we can do something against
Okay.
it when everything
Yes.
has gone into
I know.
the direction they want
Yes.
it to.
Well, yes. So thank you, because that's exactly the point I'd like to make. So they've delayed. Now, next, they introduced this COVID PSYOP. Now, I know this is another controversial topic. I'm from a medical family, and to me, this, it's fairly clear cut. But we don't need to go into details. The fact is, we had this COVID rollout. Why was this? Jackson Hole plan, BlackRock, why was it even there at that time already, August 2019? And there was a second speech by Mark Carney, my former fellow student, same year at Oxford, MPhil Economics. I mean, he did the boring stuff, Goldman Sachs back office, come on. But, he clearly played along with the game and did well for him, as you do when you play along in the game. Anyway, so he gave the other speech at that conference, namely about the need to introduce CBDCs and link them globally to have a world currency. That was also August 2019. And then in March 2020, they introduced this, timed, of course, with the lockdowns. So there is a direct link to COVID measures. And central banks came out, including the Bank of England, in March 2020, talking about, we must accelerate the introduction of CBDCs, public event, public discussion paper and all that. And of course, the idea then was, very clearly, with hindsight, that's visible, they wanted to launch the digital ID, which is a precondition for a properly working CBDC, the way they want to introduce it.
It's quite hilarious that one of the first things during COVID was that they were going to ban cash or not accept cash.
Literally one
It
of the
was
first
kind of
things. I mean,
one of the first things. But
so
why
obvious.
can't there be a CBDC with a cash economy simultaneously?
Yes. Let me just first just to complete that point. So, what we've seen is they delayed. They sort of ran this different operation, thinking, okay, that will accelerate it ultimately, but it's done the opposite. What I've experienced is when I spoke about CBDCs and the dangers of CBDCs in 2016, 17, 18, very few people were even interested. Very few people cared. Some, saw the point and realized, okay, but that's in some distant future. Now, at conferences, everyone is really interested, and they really literally woke up. I mean, I know so many doctors and people in the medical field now who understand that it's actually about financial control. And everyone is now interested in CBDCs. So they made a strategic mistake, and that makes me optimistic. We have already succeeded in delaying it. They made mistakes, and I think if we are now active enough we can prevent it. It's possible.
The thing is, like, if you look at the economy right now, especially in the US and Europe, like it's the best time to implement CBDCs now in the next years, because inflation is not coming down, right? People have people are struggling to pay. I mean, you're from Germany, right? You know the situation: electricity, gas, housing. Everything is so expensive. Like, it's the best time for them now, and that's why, like, at the point where right now, how can we stop that?
Yes, they will certainly try, but we must make clear our opposition. Central bankers have much thinner skin, and they don't handle direct opposition very well from the general public. They're very afraid of that. So that's what we need to mobilize, I think. But in terms of their plans, I mean, I'm sure the plan is particularly for Germany. I mean, the ECB has created now a property bubble in Germany since 2009. It ended in last October, a year ago. And it's now in a slow motion implosion, which, if you don't take the right policies as a central bank, will take the banking system with it. In Japan, we've seen this can take 2 decades, but that's entirely a policy variable, so the timing. I would have thought it will probably take 2-3 years, and then that will be, I think, where the ECB will try to roll out, have the banking crisis, and then roll out the CBDCs, and then people want to switch to CBDCs, and then, we're successful. That probably is the plan, but the more we realize that's the plan, the more we can take countermeasures.
So if we look at innovation theory and we look at these phase transitions, first you have introduction, then normalization, adoption, and then normalization. In Los Angeles specifically, we see this shift towards an expectation to go to cashless counting by the end, I think the beginning of next year. So do you think we are in that introduction phase to move towards centralized?
Yeah, of course. Yes, and of course that's been clear. I mean, and since 2020, Accelerate Everywhere, the number of businesses or even government agencies that say no more cash. But you can mobilize people against this. I mean, the case of the French various local areas where big supermarkets suddenly said no more cash. And then the locals got together and said, listen, guys, we've got to fight for this. And so they did the following. They all went into the supermarket and filled up their trolleys with things that they, would buy, but perhaps, 2 months worth or whatever in one go. Why not? And they go to the checkout and they have only cash with them. All of them did it. And then, you're not accepting this? Okay, well, here's the money, legal tender. What? You don't want it? Okay, then I must go. And so then they had all these full trolleys, and then, of course, all the staff complained to headquarters, and so then they reversed the policy.
They're arguing convenience.
Yeah, it reminds me of the quote,
Metropolitan, but
if you're willing to give up freedom for comfort, you deserve neither. And that leads me to, if you are dependent on the government for your survival, for your food, you're not going to put up much resistance for CBDCs.
Yes, and of course that's the link to UBI, Universal Basic Income. As I said already, 2016, they're going to push that. In fact, then already suddenly, at that time, 2016, all these billionaires came out and said, we believe we should have universal basic income. Now, that idea is 100 years old, and it was considered socialist, communist. Why do these billionaires suddenly favor it? Well, because now we have the technology for CBDCs. That's why. And it'll be the carrot, the bribe to accept the implant. To get this £1,000 a month or whatever it may be, you need to use the technology.
I hear that there's food that's getting cold. Shall we get some food and continue the discussion?
All right.
Okay.
Thank you very much.